7 o'clock. Well, Fredericton's police chief, Barry McKnight, says not to worry. He's got everything under control when it comes to following up on the Charles LeBlanc case. He was on the show yesterday morning and told us he'll make sure that an outside review takes a look at what happened and the way his officers behaved. Here's some of our conversation. Why is it that you get to determine who does the outside investigation? Why is it that you are going to determine the parameters of that investigation? Especially considering, as you say, you were the person providing oversight when this particular sequence of events unfolded. I mean, you could be found to have behaved improperly. So why are you getting to determine what the investigation looks like?
Well, the independent review is something that is going to be, I mean, at this point, is something that's going to be driven by me for the welfare of the organization and to make sure that we are acting properly to make sure that we do the right thing. So I am going to be the person who does the work as far as finding who can do this. But of course, there has to be checks and balances involved in that. The person who ultimately accepts to do this sort of a review has to be someone that I am confident that the community would see as independent enough that they are going to do an appropriate review and they are going to say whatever they need to say. So, whatever I do, you can rest assured that I will work with my colleagues, with the city, and we'll make sure that we can find someone that I think people will accept. If people don't accept that the person is independent, then that would affect people's perception about whether the recommendations are valid, whether the review is appropriate. But if I'll make sure that that's done.
That's Fredericton Police Chief Barry McKnight. He was on the program yesterday morning. Joining me now in the studio are UNB Law Professor Jula Hughes and Criminology Professor Michael Boudreau. He's head of the Criminology faculty at St. Thomas University. And they both listened to that interview that I did with Chief McKnight yesterday morning. Good morning to you both. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, let's start with a general question, Ms. Hughes. Your impressions of what you heard the chief say yesterday morning.
Well, I was pleased to hear that there would be an independent review. It seems an appropriate step to take. I was a bit surprised that, I think you were a bit surprised, I was a bit surprised to hear that Chief McKnight felt it was appropriate for him to be the person who would determine how this review unfolds. We have a provincial law called the Inquiries Act, which is designed to deal with those kinds of situations, and I would have thought it was more obvious to use the mechanisms under the Inquiries Act.
And what are those mechanisms?
So that would involve the Premier, as the Lieutenant Governor in Council, calling a public inquiry. It would be the Premier's job to define the terms of reference. The chief advantage of proceeding under the Inquiries Act, though, is that whoever conducts the inquiry ultimately has certain powers that are necessary to conduct an inquiry, whereas any ad hoc process would probably require some act of the legislature to give that person certain powers.
Are you talking about subpoena authority?
I'm talking about subpoena powers. I'm talking about the ability to swear people when they give evidence, those kinds of things.
Okay. Mr. Boudreau, your thoughts on what you heard the chief say yesterday morning?
In many ways, I concur with Professor Hughes. It was, for me, one of the most disconcerting points that the chief raised was the idea that this inquiry, this investigation would be for, and we just heard him say this again, would be for in the best interest of the organization. Really, this isn't about the best interests of the police department. This is about the best interests of the law, the best interests of the Fredericton community. The police department serves the Fredericton community. So this really is about getting to the bottom of this issue, not to improve the police department per se, but to make sure that the community itself, which places its trust in the police department, has that trust. Because right now, I think we should be somewhat concerned about the administration of the force over this incident.
Why?
Well, it would seem, again, we need to know more about who made what decision, when, why, and how, as it were. But this seems, on the surface, to be a situation that should raise concerns about how effectively the police force is being administered.
In your opinion, what role, if any, should Chief McKnight play in establishing the parameters of the inquiry?
Absolutely none. There's more than an appearance of a conflict of interest. It gets back to this ongoing concern that I and many others have had about the police investigating the police, whether it's a police-involved shooting, whether it's a police incident of alleged misconduct. The police are not, they might in their minds be the best people who can investigate other police officers, but in my mind, whether it's if we just look at it at a crass level in terms of public optics, it doesn't look good. More importantly, the police are biased, because can they really find fault in themselves? By finding fault in another police department, they are, by extension, I would argue, finding fault in themselves. So they need to push to move back and hand this over to someone else. I've never been opposed to the police investigating the police, so long as it doesn't stop there. If the police want to conduct their own internal investigations, which they often do, that's fine. But when a serious incident like this occurs, then we do need public oversight and public investigation, whether it's through a public inquiry, through a retired judge, through the police commission.
Professor Hughes, in your opinion, what is the central issue that an inquiry would have to address?
Well, it chiefly needs to address the question of why this investigation was pursued in the first place. And I think Chief McKnight did a good job yesterday addressing why this was on the public's mind. The issue is, why did this get even off the ground? Why did the police try to obtain, and ultimately did obtain, a search warrant? Why was Charles LeBlanc being investigated for an offence that is not constitutionally on the books? Why did all of this happen?
Who in the chain of authority that would have been addressed by the chief and his officers had the responsibility to say, I understand, Chief McKnight, what you are trying to do, but other jurisdictions in Canada have ruled that that particular charge 301 is unconstitutional. Who had the responsibility to put the brakes on? Was it the Crown? Was it the judge? Who in that process?
No. Ultimately, it is in a charge screening jurisdiction such as New Brunswick, it is the task of the Crown to indicate whether a person should be charged, and that's what they properly did in the end, but it took a long time to get there. But it's certainly the obligation of the police force as a whole, and of the chief in particular, to be alert to the state of the law in Canada.
Professor Boudreau, we talked yesterday about optics here in this case, and how it's affected the city and Fredericton's reputation and the citizens' perception of the police force. What do you think the optics are?
The optics are very bad, from the laying of the charge to even the delivery of the search warrant. The number of officers who were on hand is not standard procedure for that. In this case, the police knew the suspect. They knew he posed no imminent danger to them, so there was no need to have what appeared to be half the Fredericton police force on hand delivering a search warrant. In other cases, yes, when you have reason to believe that the suspect may be armed, or that it's a situation that you don't really know what you're stepping into, yes, proper police procedure would dictate that. But in this case, and then the way the issue was handled all along, it would appear from the optics that he was, Mr. LeBlanc was targeted. Maybe he's a problematic figure. That doesn't really matter. This could be any one of us. But in one case, one could also argue that the police have also zeroed in on a vulnerable member of society, a marginalized member of society. And if so, even if it wasn't deliberate, the appearance of it is still there, and for policing, the appearance of misconduct is just as dangerous, I would argue, as the actual misconduct itself.
I saw a couple of comments on social media yesterday. People were asking, what's all the fuss about? Why don't you people just let this go and let everyone move forward? What is all the fuss about?
Well, all the fuss, I think, is about, I think, to echo my earlier comment, this could be any of us, and if not, we still have to make sure that the police act appropriately, that they don't have the power, even though some may think they do, to lay a charge against anyone for anything. Now, I know I'm not suggesting that was the intention here, but that is the outcome. And so there are checks and balances that the police need to follow. Ultimately, they serve the public and the law. So this is a big deal. Yes, some people may think that Mr. LeBlanc is a problematic figure and he had it coming. Well, no. This could be if left unchecked, uninvestigated, this could happen again, and that's the problem that we need to stop here and now.
Professor Hughes, so what happens then in terms of calling an inquiry? Does the Premier recognize that this has become a law and order issue in the city and step in and say, okay, just to dispel any concern, I'm going to call for an inquiry? Or is there another more formal procedure that has to happen?
No, it's entirely at the discretion of the Premier. If he wanted to do what you've just described, he could. It may also be appropriate for Chief McKnight and or the Attorney General to make a recommendation to the Premier in that regard. But the power under the Inquiries Act is not restrained in any way. He has discretion to call an inquiry when he thinks it's appropriate.
Okay, one of the other issues that we touched on in yesterday's interview was the possession of Charles LeBlanc's property, his computer, and the files that were on that computer. And the chief suggested that the police force would maintain control of that material, would be part of the file that they have. And I'm just wondering, I mean, if you look at the sequence of events, you have a charge laid that there was a raid, seizure of equipment and property, then a ruling that there would be no charge because of the questionable constitutionality. If they obtained the property of this individual through a charge that was later proven to be or deemed unconstitutional, why do they get to keep the property?
Well, I think Chief McKnight would disagree with you that what they still have is property. That's what I understood him to say. I think in their mind they're returning the computer and they're returning the cameras and equipment, and as a result they've returned what they took. I don't agree with that characterization. There are provisions in the code that deal with production orders that make it quite clear that data and computer files are property that are returnable when an investigation leads to no charge. And so I do believe the police have an obligation to return those, and that they don't have an opportunity, for example, to maintain copies of those. But I have to tell you that it took me about 2 hours of research to figure that out yesterday, where the code draws the line. It's not a particularly obvious piece of law. And most of the case law is preoccupied not with the situation we're looking at here, but with the situation where the police have an ongoing investigation. So I don't think the chief can necessarily be faulted for taking that stance initially. The other thing I should add is that police, of course, do routinely maintain files on investigations that have come to a conclusion without a charge being laid, and there's nothing inappropriate about that. It seems to me the dividing line here is when they took things off the computer, made, say, printouts, for example, or electronic copies of files. Those are his property, they are his intellectual property, and for that reason they ought to be returned.
And is there any legal precedent for that? I'm taking it that there is none.
For keeping the files? I suspect this won't be the first time that has happened. Usually it just doesn't come up, I would guess. It's probably only because we're shining a fairly bright light on this particular situation that people are alert to that. Having said that, I don't think there's any legal ability of the police to retain those files.
Okay, I have to...
I've done this many other times in the past as well. Not the Fredericton police, the police in general. Thinking of social protest movements that I've studied, and the police will then seize computers, cameras, delete all of the information that the protesters took, and then return their said property. But the intellectual property is gone, especially if they're photos of the police making inappropriate arrests during a protest, for example.
Okay.
But there's really interesting case law emerging from the Ontario Court of Appeal just this past year, looking at what can police actually search when they seize a computer. And there's now a very different concept. It used to be that when you searched a computer, it was like seizing a piece of carpet, and then you could also, search all the fiber evidence that might be on there, all the DNA evidence. Computers are now conceptualized a bit more like a house, so you can only search the parts that you actually have authority to search, only the types of files that you have authority to search, so it's much narrower.
Okay, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for your insight. I've been speaking with Professor Jula Hughes from the Faculty of Law at the University of New Brunswick. She is one of several professors at UNB who wrote to the Fredericton Police a few weeks ago with concerns about how the LeBlanc case was being handled. And Michael Boudreau is the head of the Criminology Department at St. Thomas University in Fredericton. Any thoughts? info@fredericton.cbc.ca. It's 7:32. It's time for the news. Here's Jennifer Sweet.
As you've been hearing on Information Morning, there is more reaction today to the call for an independent review of the arrest of a local blogger for libel. The Office of Public Prosecutions decided last week not to pursue charges against Charles LeBlanc in connection with comments he posted online about a member of the Fredericton Police. Now LeBlanc's lawyer and a local legal expert are calling for a public inquiry. Catherine Harrop reports.
Fredericton Police Chief Barry McKnight has already admitted it doesn't look good, and he's consulting with others to conduct an independent review of the Charles LeBlanc case.
We need to do something to make sure that people understand what happened, and an independent review is a good way to do that.
The lawyer for Charles LeBlanc isn't so sure.
It's freedom of expression.
Stephen Folds says this isn't just about reassuring the public. It's about finding out if the Fredericton Police targeted a person because he criticized them.
I think the perception of a lot of people in Fredericton is there's been some fairly heavy-handed tactics to deal with someone who has been a critic of the Fredericton Police.
UNB law professor Jula Hughes agrees a public inquiry is the way to go.
That way we could all learn what happened and why it happened, and it would be very clearly independent of the Fredericton Police.
Jula Hughes says the decision of whether or not to call a public inquiry rests with the Premier. Catherine Harrop, CBC News, Fredericton.
Several criminal investigations in St. John culminated